A skull. Holmesley's voice was flat. He stared at Brennan. Brennan nodded. With a bullet hole in it. Another nod. In the forehead. And you have it in your closet? Yes, Brennan sighed. It seems pretty stupid, doesn't it? Well, Holmesley had been trimming a small green plant, and he plucked a leaf from it, thinking, well, I don't know. Let me get all this straight. You found the skull in a canyon and brought it home without telling anybody. Right. And you still have not called the police. I can't. Brennan, I mean it, I can't. I've started to several times, many times, but something stops me, and I can't. I just can't. And I'm having all these weird dreams that I don't understand, and things are happening to me. He told Holmesley all of it, from the camping trip to the dreams, and when he was finished, Holmesley leaned back and put his hands on the table that held the plants. My, he said. My, my, my. Brennan felt drained, tired, and so I thought I would come to you. Holmesley looked out the window. I haven't seen the skull, of course, he said, thinking out loud, so I can't say much about it. But from what you say, it sounds old. Brennan nodded. Very old. Holmesley smiled. Well, not very old. Not prehistoric, or even much over 100 years old. It had to be after guns were here. There is, after all, the bullet hole, isn't there? Again, Brennan nodded. Yes, I'm sure that's what it is. It's neat and round in the front, and the large chunk carried away in the back. How did you know? Holmesley smiled, a small, sad smile. I was a medic in Vietnam. I know something of bullet wounds. Oh. So there wasn't any hair or tissue on the skull or around it, right? Right, it was clean. That means, I think, that we can assume the skull wasn't part of a recent murder and may not constitute evidence. You sound like a lawyer, Brennan said. Holmesley looked at Brennan, his eyes serious. It may very well come to that, lawyers. If the skull does constitute evidence, you realize that, don't you? Brennan tried not to think of it, but he had realized it. And that doesn't change your mind about contacting the authorities? Brennan hesitated. It's not my mind. Sometimes I don't want to keep the skull, but a thing takes over my thinking, and I can't do it. I can't contact the police. Holmesley nodded. I see. Or maybe I don't, but I think I know what you mean. Facts are almost non-existent, he said, so it's really difficult to come at this with logic. Brennan nodded but said nothing. So we take a few shots at probabilities here. Not very scientific, but I think helpful. Jump in or correct me as we go, all right? Brennan nodded again. The skull was found in the canyons up by Oro Grande. He named the small settlement on the highway, little more than a gas station north of El Paso. Near Dog Canyon, Brennan added. So, Dog Canyon, if memory serves, is one of the last places where the Apaches and the soldiers fought. Well, Bill said there were several battles there, Brennan told him. Which means we can logically assume that there were probably fights in some of the other canyons, say where you found the skull. And that it's an Indian skull, Brennan cut in. Holmesley held up his hand. Not necessarily. We can guess that, surmise that, assume that, speculate that, but we cannot know that, not without examining the skull. Correction, without having an expert examine the skull. I'm not an expert at pathology, but... I thought you knew about these things, Brennan said. I mean, it's almost like a fossil, isn't it? But, Holmesley interrupted and finished, I do know an expert pathologist. Brennan frowned. This pathologist and I are good friends, and I think I can promise you he won't tell anybody about the skull. Brennan leaned back, waiting, and realized with a shock that he was waiting for a voice in his mind to tell him what to do. Little voices in my mind, he thought. Oh, good, I'm waiting for little voices in my mind. Oh, great. None came. All right, he said, standing. I'll go get the skull and meet you at this man's place. Better yet, Holmesley said, rising. I'll call him and we'll take the car and drive down there. It might make it a little easier for you if I'm with you. What do you mean easier? Where does he work? Holmesley stopped with his hand on the door. Where a lot of pathologists work. At the morgue. And he moved out the door. Brennan hesitated only for a moment, thought, "Oh, the morgue. Of course," and followed. The morgue. There was a room with metal tables and bright overhead lights, and Brennan did not want to be in the room. Everything in flat white, with large sinks along the wall and drains all over the place, and the constant sound of running water. And Brennan followed Holmesley into the room and really did not want to be there. On one table was the body of an old man. He was nude, lying flat on his back with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, his body all sunken and old and thin and very, very dead. Holmesley's friend, who turned out to be named Tibbets, was tall and thin, wearing a smock spattered with blood and rubber gloves. He was leaning over the body, holding a scalpel, about to make a cut in the top of the dead man's stomach, and Brennan almost lost his lunch. He could not turn away, but couldn't stand it either, and he stopped. Dead. Tibbets looked up, saw them, and stood away from the corpse, and Brennan thought, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." "The boy with the skull," Tibbets said. "The big mystery." He and Holmesley exchanged looks. Then Tibbets came forward and took the shoebox Brennan was carrying the skull in. "Let's see." He took the box to a side table so that Brennan, gratefully, had to turn his back on the body. Carefully, almost tenderly, Tibbets removed the skull. Brennan had wrapped it in a towel, and Tibbets removed the towel gingerly. He put the skull on the table on a small foam pad and pulled down a large magnifying glass and light. In the harsh white light against the metal table, the skull looked very small and somehow sad, forlorn. Tibbets must have felt it as well, because he seemed to take extra care. He first gave the skull a close visual examination through the magnifying lamp, turning it this way and that, over and around, humming songs from the 60s. Brennan stood there and watched him and tried not to think of the body on the table in back of him. Tibbets spent a long time looking at the bullet hole and brought another small, high-intensity lamp into play, held it almost in the hole. He nodded, broke the humming for a second, then started again. He turned the skull over and studied the teeth one at a time. All of this took close to 10 minutes, and Brennan fidgeted from foot to foot. Finally, Tibbets took out 2 sets of calipers and made measurements. When this was done, he put the instruments down and turned to Brennan and Holmesley. "Well?" Holmesley asked. "Well, I'll tell you first what I know for certain, then the guesses, all right?" Brennan and Holmesley nodded. Tibbets put the skull in the center of the foam pad and brought the light close down upon it. "First the wound. It's definitely a bullet wound. Judging by the size of it and the damage done to the back of the skull, I would say it was a very large bore rifle, say 45 caliber or bigger." He paused, thinking. "The wound was done from very close range, probably inches, less than a foot." "How can you tell?" Holmesley asked. "Because burned powder from the charge was actually driven into the bone of the skull. The scars are still there, the marks, and for that to happen the muzzle of the weapon had to be nearly touching the victim." "So this man was killed by a large rifle," Holmesley put in, "shot from very close range." "Not a man," Tibbets said. "Well, you said he." Tibbets nodded. "I did, but not a man. He was a boy." "A boy?" Again Tibbets nodded. "He was an Indian boy. You can tell by the skull shape, about 14 years old." "Take me, Spirit. Take me up." It rolled into Brennan's mind, and he reeled with it, almost fell over. Holmesley put out a hand to catch him. "Are you all right?" "I don't know. Air. I need air." Tibbets shook his head. "I forget sometimes where I work and how it gets other people. Let's go out to the lounge." "But," Brennan thought, weaving as they led him out of the room, but no, I'm not sick. I am not sick. I am not me. I am not me."